Indonesia's environment minister has told G20 officials the world risks heading into uncharted territory if they fail to act together against the climate crisis. The call came at a G20 environmental meeting on Bali. Just this month, catastrophic flooding has killed more than 1,000 people in Pakistan, while much of China has been experiencing a crippling drought and record heat. Here's more of what Siti Nurabaya Bakar said.
We know that climate change could become an amplifier and multiplier of the crisis. It would not only wipe out all development progress that has been achieved over the past decades, particularly in emerging economies, but it would also propel us over an environmental tipping point into uncharted territory where no future will be sustainable.
And if you're in Pakistan, that future already looks bleak. Here, more than 33 million people, that's 1 in 7 Pakistanis, have been affected by flooding that followed heavy rain. Many are homeless, have lost their finances, and are in areas that are proving hard to reach because roads have been washed away. UN Chief Antonio Guterres has described it as a monsoon on steroids and appealed for $160 million in emergency funding to help the country. But Pakistan's floods aren't an isolated event. Just this year, South Asia has seen periods of extreme heat, followed by heavy rains and floods. And most of these events are occurring with greater intensity over regular periods of time.
South Asia's battle against extreme weather this year began in March, when scorching temperatures battered the region. Pakistan reported record temperatures that exceeded 49 degrees Celsius. India received 70% less rainfall than usual. Residents across the region had hoped for relief, which came in May, but went way too extreme. The monsoon season began earlier than expected and hit the Indian states of Assam and Meghalaya in full force. Unprecedented rainfall and flooding left over 100 dead and millions of homes submerged.
This is the third time that we're facing floods. This time, the flood has completely swamped the streets. Whatever was repaired after the second flood is now again in ruins.
The rain also hit neighboring Bangladesh, affecting especially the low-lying areas. While heavy rainfall during South Asia's monsoon season is normal, flooding in such an intensity is not, or not yet. But monsoon patterns are changing, meaning Bangladesh will have to cope with more unpredictable spells of disasters.
Due to our geographical location, we have to live with floods. We have to accept this and act accordingly.
And most recently, Pakistan. Flooding has submerged more than a third of the country. Over 30 million people have been affected. 1,000 people died. This monsoon season will eventually come to an end, but devastation like this will likely repeat over and over again in the coming years and decades.
And let's get more on this with Dr. Roxy Matthew Kaul from the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology in Pune. Dr. Kaul, South Asia has seen extreme heat in the months of March and April, followed by flooding in May and June. And now we have catastrophic flooding in Pakistan. Is all of this connected?
Right, Biresh. South Asia is a poster child of extreme weather events churned out from climate change, a rapid pace in climate change, I would say. And we see a drastic trend in increase of extreme weather events like heat waves, droughts, floods, and cyclones in this region comprising of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And this is particularly because South Asia is in such a geographical location with Indian Ocean around it, in the tropical waters, which is warming quite faster than any other ocean basins in the globe. Indian Ocean is one of the fastest warming ocean basins. And this is churning out extreme weather events like cyclones and very extreme monsoon wind bursts, which is carrying a lot of moisture with it. So there are occasions when the monsoon winds are strong, and there are occasions when the monsoon winds are weak.
Right.
In general, we see a long-term reduction in the strength of the monsoon circulation. So we have droughts, but in between, we see these monsoon winds are having bursts when it's taking up all that moisture from the ocean and dumping all of a sudden in some parts of South Asia. There is a clear global warming signal here. One of the important properties of global warming is that when the air is warmer, the air holds more moisture and for a longer time.
Right.
So it doesn't rain for a long time, but when it rains, all that moisture it has absorbed for that long time, it dumps all of a sudden. So you get a season's rain or a month's rain in a few hours to a few days. And that's what we see across South Asia. And this is not just in Pakistan. We saw that in India happening this year, even despite some of the regions, while some of the regions were going through droughts.
Right.
And we saw heavy and extreme rains and floods happening in eastern parts of India and Bangladesh.
So just hearing you describe this, I just need to ask you, Dr. Kaul, if you think that South Asia is therefore in the midst of a climate emergency.
Right. I would say that. The early signals of climate change are arising from here itself. So that we saw that just before the monsoon season, we had a long heat wave. And it was not just the intensity of the heat wave; it was the length of that heat wave. It was not a one-day heat wave or a heat wave for a week. It was a season-long heat wave starting from March, April, May, and then creeping into June. And it coincided with dry conditions. The rains were very low during that time. It didn't rain for a quite long time. So that intensified the dry heat conditions during that time. And it's also a vicious cycle you see during the heat waves. Since you need to cool, you power up more air conditioning, or for the agriculture, you power up more irrigation sectors.
So,
for
Dr.
irrigation,
Kaul, just given these various impacts that you're talking about, would you say that governments in the region are prepared to deal with these sorts of changes, or do they need to be doing more? Right now, no. None of the nationally determined commitments for reducing emissions are sufficient to keep the temperatures down below 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2040 or below 2 degrees Celsius by 2060. Yeah, and the changes that we see until now, the extreme weather events like cyclones, heat waves, floods, are in response to that 1 degree Celsius. Right. And even as a climate scientist, I cannot imagine the impacts of a 2 degrees Celsius change. Yeah. So the next step for the government to do is urgently take up adaptation measures. And we need local adaptation measures because though climate change is global, the impacts are local, very localized. You see floods happening in one region, droughts happening in another region, heat waves in another region or another season. So based on the local conditions and climatic changes, we need to do that assessment. Disaster-proof each region at panchayat or village level. Right. We'll have to leave it there for the time being, unfortunately. Dr. Roxy Matthew Kaul, thank you so much for joining us today on this important subject. Similar variations in climate are being seen across southwestern China as well. For much of the past few weeks, a record drought kept water levels dangerously low. But now with the return of the rains, there are fears of flooding. However, the recent dry spell has already shown people how climate change can directly impact their lives. Correspondent Patrick Falk reports from the city of Chongqing.
Dark clouds hang over Chongqing's horizon. At last, there's rainfall. For weeks, this region had suffered under intense drought. It killed crops and caused bushfires. It also drastically lowered water levels along the Yangtze.
It's been a long time since it rained, more than 40 days.
The Yangtze is the world's third largest river and a water source for about 600 million people. Its currents also fuel much of China's extensive hydropower infrastructure. Parts of the river dried up during the drought, sparking severe energy shortages in Chongqing and other places. Restaurant owner Yang, who operates inside a downtown mall in Chongqing, is just one of the many local business owners affected.
Normally, we'd have everything on. These days, the government is promoting energy-saving measures like using the fan instead of air conditioners. There isn't enough electricity.
Authorities had ordered malls to only stay open for 5 hours a day at the height of the heat wave. Yang says operating hours are still restricted and that many businesses are also making their own contributions, like keeping lights switched off to cut energy consumption.
Well, you can see there are lots of efforts going into trying to save energy and to address this power crunch. Here on underground trains, aircon temperatures are being dialed up and lights are being dimmed, so every other light here is switched off right now. But these really are just stopgap measures to help alleviate the problem in the short term.
In the long term, environmentalists like Li Jiao of Greenpeace say policymakers must set more aggressive green targets to tackle the effects of climate change.
Extreme climate events like this are causing a lot of damage and are spurring a lot of public discussion. These factors could push the government to take a more proactive approach in fighting climate change and reaching its carbon neutral goals.
At the same time, though, the recent heat wave and the havoc it's caused have raised questions over southwestern China's reliance on hydropower. There are fears policymakers may resort to burning more fossil fuels like coal to meet its energy demands and to reduce the risk of future energy crunches brought on by extreme weather conditions. But it's likely to make it harder for China to achieve its goal of going carbon neutral by 2060. And it could contribute towards even more unpredictable and extreme weather in the future.